Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Way Out Project initiative. Many things are happening in the world at the speed of light. I mean, every day the sun shines on us. We have more and more news that are not positive for us, for the country, or for the world. And in that sense, I want to start with you guys today. With the coronavirus is not mutating to become more virulent. Scientific review suggests a vaccine is likely to work while debunking the myth that the virus was created in a Chinese lab. This is news from September the 17th, 2020. The study traced the evolutionary origins of the coronavirus back to its origin, found it is too different to other coronaviruses to have been man-made, and thirdly, the virus has an unusually slow mutation rate and is not changing to become more severe or infectious. Again, September 17, 2020. This is according to Mail Online, a British producer of news. The virus which causes COVID-19, called SARS-CoV-2, is mutating at an unusually slow rate, a new study finds. Analysis by experts at the Royal Society also found none of the alterations made so far to the coronavirus genetic code are making it more infectious or severe. The findings are reassuring for clinicians and epidemiologists as it indicates people who have previously caught the disease will have protection from reinfection. It also offers hope that when a vaccine is available, it will be effective in the long term. Other findings from this study prove the coronavirus evolved naturally in bats and was not forged in a Chinese lab, as some conspiracy theories claim. Okay, a rapid review of available data has been published by a preprint by the Royal Society, that is SET/C, that's SET/C, Science in Emergency Tasking /COVID-19 Task Force, made up for Britain's leading virologists. They say the location and nature of mutations on SARS-CoV-2 have thus far not impacted its virulence. It had previously been suggested by experts that the virus was mutating and becoming less severe but more infectious. Now, according to the latest findings, this theory can be comprehensively dispelled. The mutations that have evolved so far throughout the pandemic have instead left markers that allows researchers to track the spread of the virus. This is a key tool in allowing policymakers to decide how best to restrict this spread of the contagion. This is very important. This is a key tool in allowing policymakers to decide how best to restrict the spread of the contagion. Professor Geoffrey Smith, the lead author of the research and the Department of Pathology at the University of Cambridge, said, and I quote, "It's good news that SARS-CoV-2 has so far proven pretty stable because it's easier to detect and treat a virus that is fairly stationary. Whole genome sequencing allows us to understand not just that someone is infected, but to define precisely the strain of virus and so work out where the infection probably came from. It allows us to track strains of virus that become dominant and that might replicate or transmit more efficiently." Unquote. One downside that the researchers point out is that even a slow mutation rate could allow the virus to develop resistance to certain rocks. But this is a speculative issue, and in the virus' current guise, the authors of the study are confident the disease is not becoming more severe or infectious. That was 2020. As part of the study, the experts looked at the origin of the virus in the UK and tracked it back to its genetic origin. They found its closest relative is a bat coronavirus found in China called RATG13. However, it is only 97% identical, an enormous difference when it comes to viral genetic material. previous research found that it is possible SARS-CoV-2 first split from its ancestors in 1948 and has been residing in bats who are immune for around 70 years. That's what they said in 2020. It comes from bats. It's stationary since 1948, and again found that it is possible SARS-CoV-2 first split from its ancestor in 1949 and has been residing in bats who are immune for around 70 years, according to the experts. The difference between SARS-CoV-2 and other coronaviruses is too large for it to have been made in lab and deliberately released. And I quote, "The degree of divergence between SARS-CoV-2 and all other known coronaviruses is insufficient to refute the assertion that the COVID-19 pandemic arose by the deliberate or accidental release of a known virus, e.g. RATG13, and makes the unsupported claim that SARS-CoV-2 was created artificially in a laboratory highly improbable," the researchers explain in the paper. Instead, the study confirms the virus jumped into humans either straight from bats or via an intermediary mammalian host. Professor Smith said, and I quote, "There is nothing like solid evidence to bust the myths that are spread by conspiracy theorists." And I quote, "It is understandable that when a new virus emerges, there will be speculation about its origins, but the pace at which the global science community has developed our understanding of the genetics of SARS-CoV-2 has been spectacular." And he keeps quoting, "That has allowed us to trace its spread and develop diagnostic tests and candidate vaccines. It also allows us to debunk some of the more colorful conspiracy theories," unquote. So yeah, sure, when this document came out for us, for the country, for the world, according to the investigation and research made in Britain, in the UK, it was trustworthy, and we shouldn't believe in any conspiracy theories. Everything was conspiracy theories regarding the probability that a virus was, of course, escaped or on purpose spread from the Wuhan laboratories, virologist laboratories, with, of course, the help of the NIH of the United States in cooperation with China's government, and all of a sudden the virus went away. But no, according to this inform that you just heard, it's all conspiracy theories, and people should stop spreading misinformation and disinformation, because that is impossible according to what you just heard. But the facts are different now, as we unvaccinated people knew from the beginning, especially if the people knew plenty of things regarding corporations that we have spoken about before the pandemia in these programs. But no, it was not apparent. It is a fact. Now that we know that it's not only a conspiracy theory, but in fact, the laboratories, the Pfizer laboratories and Moderna laboratories, didn't have a clue about anything that these doctors mentioned in this mail.com that you just heard, that I'm going to cite again, because the same newspaper or news broadcaster on the internet, mail.com, a British producer of news, is saying the contrary 2 years later. So the conspiracy theories were conspiracy facts. But let's take a look to this one first.
If you don't get vaccinated, you're antisocial. This is what the Dutch Prime Minister and Health Minister told us. You don't get vaccinated just for yourself, but also for others. You do it for all of society. That's what I said. Today, this turned out to be complete nonsense. In a COVID hearing in the European Parliament, one of the Pfizer directors just admitted to me, at the time of introduction, the vaccine had never been tested on stopping the transmission of the virus. This removes the entire legal basis for the COVID passport. The COVID passport that led to massive institutional discrimination as people lost access to essential parts of society. I find this to be shocking, even criminal. Please watch the video until the end. Voor u, mevrouw Small, heb ik de volgende vraag waar ik een duidelijk antwoord op wil. And I will speak in English so there are no misunderstandings. Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunisation before it's entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science to really understand what is taking place in the market.
This is scandalous. Millions of people worldwide felt forced to get vaccinated because of the myth that you do it for others. Now this turned out to be a cheap lie. This should be exposed. Please share this video.
That is exactly why the new Premier of Alberta here in Canada, Danielle Smith, stood strong for us, for the country, and for the world. Knowingly or not, because of the Freedom Convoy begun in Canada. So if she's standing for us, for the country, she's doing it unconsciously for the world. This movement for freedom began with the truckers here in Canada. From Vancouver to Ottawa. You should check that, my program on Rumble. And unknowingly or knowingly, she did us, the country and the world, a favor. And that's why, because ironically, this movement spread like a virus all around the world, the Freedom Convoy.
I want our frontline workers to know reinforcements are coming. We cannot continue understaffing our hospitals and then forcing our frontline workers to work mandatory overtime and be called in on days off and have to cancel their holidays. That's been the situation for the last 2.5 years. And a lot of that problem was created by policies at Alberta Health Services of having mandatory vaccinations. So it prevented us from being able to hire back everyone who had been let go up until about 2.5 months ago when Cabinet directed them to end the mandate. Prevented us from being able to graduate students across the full range of professions because they also had vaccine mandates. It prevented us from being able to hire from other jurisdictions through the full range of people who would have otherwise wanted to come here because of vaccine mandates. So they actually, at the management level, made things even worse for our front line. And when you see that kind of poor management, especially since the Premier gave them direct instruction, I remember this very clearly, because everyone said, okay, well, if this is about saving the healthcare system, let's give them the time, let's give them the money, and let's let them do it. He gave them direct instruction to increase surge capacity by 1,100 beds. And then when the Delta variant came along, they admitted they hadn't done that they had reduced surge capacity. So this is a management problem. It is not a problem with our frontline workers. Our frontline workers need to be supported. And when it happens in a business, when they fail to meet targets and they fail to meet direction, you change the management. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to change the management.
I have a question about vaccine choice and how you want to protect that under the Human Rights Act. I'm wondering how vaccine choice, how you see that as equal to something like race, gender, sexuality, which we protect because those are not about choices.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is that the community that faced the most restrictions on their freedoms in the last year were those who made a choice not to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in my lifetime where a person was fired from their job or not allowed to watch their kids play hockey or not allowed to go visit a loved one in long-term care or hospital or not allowed to go get on a plane to either go across the country to see family or even travel across the border. So they have been the most discriminated against group that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. That's a pretty extreme level of discrimination that we have seen. I don't take away any of the discrimination that I've seen in those other groups that you mentioned, but this has been an extraordinary time in the last year in particular, and I want people to know that I find that unacceptable, that we are not going to create a segregated society on the basis of a medical choice.
So thank you. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Danielle Smith, new Premier of Canada, for standing for us, for the country and for the world.
Sortons vite de l'OTAN! Sortons vite de l'OTAN! Sortons vite de l'OTAN!
Anti-NATO protests have gripped France as the country grapples with the cost of living crisis. The protests come amid a strike by union workers at France's petroleum refineries. A massive crowd of protesters marched through the center of Paris on Saturday, demanding that France radically change its stance on NATO and the EU, international media reported. The protesters have also called for the resignation of the country's President Emmanuel Macron. The demonstration reflects similar rallies being held across Europe in opposition to their respective governments' support for the war in Ukraine. The constant supply of arms by mainly NATO members has prolonged the conflict in Eastern Europe, leading to the suffering of civilians caught up in the crossfire. The march was organized by the right-wing Les Patriotes, the Patriots Party, led by Florian Philippot, the former deputy head of Marine Le Pen's national rally. Dubbed the National Meeting of Resistance, the march attracted thousands of people, according to Philippot, who was also a member of the European Parliament between 2014 and 19. The demonstrators were holding a large banner reading resistance and smaller placards that read Frexit, a reference to a demand that France leaves the EU. Many protesters were also waving the national flag. According to videos published by Philippot on social media, the crowd was chanting, "Let's go out of NATO." They also demanded the ouster of the French President Emmanuel Macron as they marched near the Parliament building, the footage purports to show. The protesters denounced NATO warmongering as well as economic disruption and energy and health restrictions linked to the sanctions the EU imposed on Russia over the conflict in Ukraine. French officials have not commented on the rally and provided no official figures as to the number of demonstrators. The French media mostly ignored the event as well. According to the website of Les Patriots, similar rallies were also held on September 3rd and 17th. Last month, an estimated 70,000 people protested in Prague against the Czech government, calling on the ruling coalition to do more to control the soaring energy prices and voicing opposition to the European Union and NATO. For many years, the Kremlin has made it clear that if NATO continued to mass troops and weapons on the Russian border, the expansion would likely be met with serious resistance by the Russians, even with military action. On the other hand, Europe's decision to cave into American pressure and impose unprecedented sanctions on Moscow has heavily restricted the gas supplies to the continent, which have instead pushed the energy prices up, leaving many in poverty. Europe relied on 40% of Russian gas before the conflict erupted.
Sortons vite de l'OTAN! Sortons vite de l'OTAN! Sortons vite de l'OTAN! Sortons vite de l'OTAN!
Subscribe to One India channel and never miss an update.
I know. You might say that these protests in France are for a different reason. And it is. They are for a different reasons. It's an energy crisis in Europe. But all these protests became together all around the world because of the pandemia lies that has spread all around the world with the World Health Organization. We're going to get there later. But the pandemia was the trigger for us, the country and the world, to react today, tomorrow, and every day, as long as the sun shines on us and the nights come together to accompany us to fight and stand up for the truth, just like our premier did in Alberta. And I hope that many other governors, presidents, and prime ministers do the same. But the last video is a consequence of the lies of the pandemia. Now, let's get back to the pandemia and the lies that we have been told in the hands of the super rich that are, of course, responsible and have to be called to accountability in the world's court. Normally, I have the documents for you. It was not easy for me to get the documents. I couldn't get them from the internet. It was not easy, not this time. So I'm going to rely on other producers in order to expose this situation and why the unvaccinated, which are not against vaccination, we are just against the mandates and the lack of investigations and research for a normal vaccine that takes at least 5 years minimum to develop. Some of them 10 years. So this is all improvising and it's all lies. Well, back to the point. So it was not lies, it was not conspiracy theories, it was true.
Rob, this is a significant admission by Pfizer, is it not?
Yes, it is. I think it's the first time that that someone admitted this, and it was an important question. I asked this question also to AstraZeneca and Moderna, but they made a workaround and they didn't give me an answer. But Pfizer was very clear in speaking out, and I think it's important because of this narrative. You have to do it to protect your grandparents, and you do it for others. You do it for all of society. All that, all the messages that was brought by all the governments here in the West. Because of that, the Corona Pass was introduced, and it had a significant impact on people's lives. There were people who were not able to work, who lost their job, people who lost their businesses, families were divided, and also friends. I think it's, and now it seems to be a disinformation from our governments.
Yeah. Well, if you just to look at those governments, you'll remember that Monsieur Macron in France said he wanted to emmerder the unvaccinated, which is a rather rude word, approximates to the English. He wanted to really piss them off. If you look at Canada, for example, if you were unvaccinated, you were forbidden from getting on an aeroplane or a train. In some German states, you were forbidden from going to the supermarket to buy food to keep yourself alive. And it appears that this lady from Pfizer is now saying at the time they introduced this, they never had any evidence that it would stop transmission of the virus. So where did all these governments get the idea to tell us you can't go anywhere if you're unvaccinated?
Well, yeah, that is exactly what I was looking for, because I'm searching for this answer for 2 years now, and because it had such an impact on people's life, I really wanted to know. And, well, yeah, where is this coming from? It seems to be disinformation from our government. So, well, this is really something that the people who are responsible for this, in my opinion, if the impact was huge on people's lives, I think these people should be held responsible.
Well, we've heard all this talk. I mean, as I'm sure you know, and you've been exposed to it as well, that if you question anything you're told by the government, people say you're not following the science. The lady from Pfizer basically just told you that there's no science behind any of these statements. That when people say you can't go into a restaurant and have a cup of coffee if you're unvaccinated, that's just something that a government made up out of it, basically pulled it out of its own bottom and inflicted it on society.
Yes. Exactly. Follow the science, and we still see that on all the social media. If you make a post about, I'm in this COVID committee, so I try to inform people by showing them the questions and the answers. We do not really get real answers, but this was exceptional and a very important one. But if you make a post about COVID and about real questions you ask, you immediately get a sign beneath your post about COVID, this COVID warning. They also removed me. I was cancelled from LinkedIn by exposing just simple questions. So it's still going on, and especially that there is no scientific basis for this narrative. I think it's. For me, it was really surprising that I received this answer, but it's very necessary that it has come out. We should never have any COVID passport again based on this so-called science.
Why I cite this? Because it is important for us, the country and the world, to understand that how the scientists operate. And especially when we heard from the diagnostics, let's say, from Mrs. Small, who said that no, they didn't know what was going on. According to this, they knew, but according to her, they never knew.
Hello, everyone.
Questions? Prime Minister, that there was no justification for it. Again, what should the consequences be for that?
I think the important thing is for Canadians to understand the situation we were in and the choices we make. We didn't enter into using the Emergencies Act lightly. We used it with a sense of it was the necessary tool at the time. We used it in a way that was measured and proportionate, and we're really pleased that the Commission is going to be able to hear from all these witnesses, and that was why I offered to appear.
We have demonstrated as a government how important it is to move forward with a full anti-racism strategy, to move forward to push back against this rise in intolerance we're seeing. Unfortunately, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, there is a range of intolerance that is rising across the country, perhaps linked with the pandemic, perhaps linked with the rise in populism. We need to use all the tools we can to push back on it, and that's who Canadians are. We're a country that understands that differences can and must be a source of richness, of strength, and that's what we will always stand for.
So do you support that bill? Or?
We're going to continue to look at every way that makes a difference in moving forward to push back against racism and intolerance.
Prime Minister.
Or push back against intolerance.
I have a question about vaccine choice and how you want to protect that under the Human Rights Act. I'm wondering how vaccine choice, how you see that as equal to something like race, gender, sexuality, which we protect because those are not about choices.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is that the community that faced the most restrictions on their freedoms in the last year were those who made a choice not to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in my lifetime where a person was fired from their job, or not allowed to watch their kids play hockey, or not allowed to go visit a loved one in long-term care or hospital, or not allowed to go get on a plane to either go across the country to see family or even travel across the border. So they have been the most discriminated against group that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. That's a pretty extreme level of discrimination that we have seen. I don't take away any of the discrimination that I've seen in those other groups that you mentioned, but this has been an extraordinary time in the last year in particular, and I want people to know that I find that unacceptable, that we are not going to create a segregated society on the basis of a medical choice.
There is growing concern right now about the number of advanced or even undiagnosed cases of breast cancer in Canada. And here's why. After the pandemic hit, there was a big drop in routine mammograms. In Ontario, about 400,000 fewer were performed than usual. And that means some cancers that would have been caught early simply weren't. As Mike Crawley shows us, doctors are already seeing the effects of that.
When Laura Greer got a mammogram last November, the radiologist ordered an immediate biopsy and told her to get a referral to a surgeon.
It was one of the most traumatic parts of it because you knew it wasn't good.
Greer had been due for that mammogram 7 months earlier, but it was delayed by COVID backlogs. Her diagnosis? Stage 4 breast cancer.
Very hard to not be angry at could it have been caught earlier if mammogram had happened when it should have happened.
New figures show that Ontario's breast screening program has performed 422,000 fewer mammograms than expected since the pandemic began. That means as many as 3,000 cases of breast cancer were missed.
So this is the same area.
Doctors are now seeing the impact.
What we're noticing is that women are presenting with bigger cancers and with their lymph nodes being involved. Here is you see a mass.
Catching cancer at a later stage has consequences for treatment and the chances of survival.
Before that we would have done surgery and maybe some radiation for it. Now it's surgery, radiation, and maybe chemotherapy.
This is not unique to Ontario. Routine mammograms also dropped off in other provinces, by about 1/3 in British Columbia and Alberta at the start of the pandemic. There's been a similar trend with colon and cervical cancer.
Certainly in my practice, I saw a wave of more advanced cancers that I think were linked to delays in diagnosis.
Ontario's breast screening program is now back to its normal pace.
This is a good time to make an appointment and get your mammogram in.
Laura Greer is responding to treatment.
I go to work full time, I have 2 children, I do all of those things, but you never know when that could change all of a sudden.
Mike Crawley, CBC News, Toronto.
Oh yes, but it's all our fault. It's the unvaccinated people that cause all this trouble in the hospitals and all. This needs a very thorough investigation, guys. We're going to dedicate a whole program for that. But these delays on the mammographies and the spreading of the cancer for 2.5 years is not unvaccinated people cause or fault. It's the irresponsibility of government to take to scientific ground and make decisions accordingly, which has been demonstrated throughout this program, which was not what they did nowhere around the world. And like I said, pushed like a drug in the streets. The vaccine was pushed like a drug in the streets by the World Health Organization and the United Nations, all the media and all presidents and prime ministers around the world. That is a disgrace, but it's good that that happened so that we can understand, like in the war in Ukraine, against Russia. I'm sorry, but for the people of Ukraine, we all do. We all are. Especially when coming from countries at war. Yes. But this is not created by Russia. Don't lie to us like with the pandemia dudes. We're sick of it.
So,
Likewise.
how important is it that people get this shot as we are seeing cases of COVID-19 go up this fall?
I think it's quite important for people to get a bivalent booster when they are eligible to do so for a few reasons. I think the Omicron component of the bivalent vaccine has been shown to provide better antibody titers, and I think we're accumulating more and more evidence that where you get the biggest protection is relative to how long it's been since your last dose. So certainly for people who are definitely at 6 months or beyond since their last dose, assuming they didn't get infected in the interim, those are the people who really should go and get one of these boosters as soon as it's available.
So just to be clear, are we then talking for some folks about a 5th COVID shot?
That's correct. I think there's been some talk throughout the course of the pandemic as to whether we will wind up with regular recurring boosters in the same way that we have seasonal influenza vaccine. And it's certainly a real possibility, I think, given the way that this pandemic has evolved.
Okay. If you've had Moderna shots so far and you're thinking about getting your next shot, can you take this Pfizer-approved shot?
Absolutely. You don't get a special set of giftware for staying only with one product or the other. I would say whatever the most easily available bivalent booster is, that's the one to get. Of course, Moderna has been approved a little bit before, and it's now distributed across most parts of the country. Pfizer approved more recently and is just coming online in Ontario as of today.
Let's talk about long COVID. Vaccines protect people from serious infection, but what about that? We're hearing more and more people talk about long COVID. They feel they have it.
So that's, I think, something that we are still coming to terms with in terms of having good definitions for what constitutes long COVID, which is quite critical when you're talking about a disease that can have so many different manifestations. There certainly has been some continued suggestion in the literature that vaccination can help both reduce the risk of ever going on to have long COVID, and in certain situations may even be a part of the treatment of it, although that's an area that is still under a lot of active investigation.
Yeah, and what about the stress that long care COVID cases are putting on the healthcare system? Do you think hospitals are prepared to deal with these people?
I think when you look at some of the numbers across the country in terms of numbers of beds that are occupied right now, the ongoing difficulties we're having with staffing, I think you make a good argument that we're on the edge of being prepared for the regular things that hospitals should be dealing with even before anything to do with the pandemic. So I think any additional stress to the healthcare system is something that we need to take a very active role in trying to reduce as much as possible, because I really don't want to see our healthcare system, if we have, for example, over the course of this winter, surges of COVID-19 cases as well as influenza and other respiratory viruses on top of where we currently are.
Dr. Outen, great to see you this morning. Thanks so much for all that. Really appreciate it.
Is indeed, and welcome Dr. Kelly Victory. And poor Robert, I could talk to him for a month, but now I'm going to hand him over to you for a few minutes. Dr. Kelly Victory.
And you ate into my time, so
I'm sorry. Keep going. I'm sorry. I told you I could go for a month.
Bobby, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. I have obviously read the book and subsequently did watch the documentary or movie, and it's brilliantly done. And thank you for doing it. Drew and I have disagreed about a number of things throughout this pandemic, although I think he's maybe coming over to our side a little bit more. Both you and Drew are more generous than I am with regard to our colleagues in medicine. I am a disaster, mass casualty, and public health specialist, and I've been reporting on the medical disaster and public health disaster that this pandemic response has been from the beginning. We knew from the very beginning that we weren't all at equal risk from this thing. We knew that masks do nothing to stop the spread of respiratory viruses. We knew that social distancing was a totally made-up construct. We knew that readily available cheap medications like IVM and HCQ were very, very successful at treating this thing. I reported from the very beginning that the vaccines would be an abject failure and likely cause significant harm to people, and on and on. So what I didn't know as much about was the details of the fraud, corruption, and illegal activity, and I will call it that was going on and has been going on at the CDC and FDA, likely for decades. If I really connect the dots from all the research you have done on that part of it. My question to you is, where the heck is Congress? Where the heck are the people who are the oversight? Yes, these agencies have sort of run, they've sort of gone rogue, if you will. But where the heck is the regulation, the oversight?
Well, what you have is an industry which is now the largest industry in the history of the world and most profitable. It's now more than oil. For most of my life, the oil industry was the biggest industry and wielded the biggest clout on Capitol Hill. But that's now dwarfed by pharma. Pharma has more lobbyists on Capitol Hill than there are congressmen, senator, and Supreme Court justices combined. It gives, I think, double in lobbying contributions than the next largest lobbying group, which are which is oil, and then I think it's something like 3 times what military contractors give Congress. And so you have, basically all of the institutions in our democracy that are supposed to stand between a greedy corporation and a vulnerable child have been eliminated by this industry. And they started with Congress. The next big thing is the press. So we changed the law. The FCC changed the law in 1997 to allow, for the first time in history, direct-to-consumer advertising by pharmaceutical companies on television. So, and there's only one other country in the world that allows that, which is New Zealand. Of course, we both have, as a result of that, we have the highest consumption of pharmaceutical products of any country in the world. We have, I think, we take 3 times. Americans on average take 3 times the amount of pharmaceutical drugs as Europeans. We have the worst health outcomes. We're 79th in the world in terms of health outcomes. So all those drugs, in fact, the 3 leading causes of death in this country are number 1, cancer, number 2, heart attacks, and the 3rd cause of death is misuse of pharmaceutical drugs or misprescriptions. So they're killing us, and they own the television and the media, which is why you see so much censorship today. The biggest advertiser today on TV by far, dwarfing everybody else, is pharmaceutical companies. About 85%, 75% of total revenues, advertising revenues to the major networks are coming from pharma. On the network news, the evening news is much higher because that is their demographic. It's kind of older people who are buying a lot of pharmaceutical drugs. So it's around 85% of the network news revenues. And what that means is that they're not just buying advertising space, but they're buying content on the network news. Anderson Cooper has a $12 million annual salary, but about $10 million of that is coming from Pfizer. So who is he working for? Is he working for the American public or his viewers, or is he working for the pharmaceutical industry? And I would suggest to you that, this whole campaign of fear to scare us into compliance with the pharmaceutical paradigm, and then, to shame those of us who asked questions about the vaccine or who resisted the vaccine, to make those people kind of redheaded stepchildren and second-class citizens in our country and subject to all kinds of bigotry. That those are pharmaceutical policies that were promoted by the talking heads on TV. I once Roger Ailes was the founder of Fox News. And everything that he believed in, I was antithetical to everything I believed in. But when I was 18 years old, I spent 3 months in a tent with him in East Africa. It's a long story about how that happened, but we had this friendship that endured our political differences. And so I spent a lot of time talking with him. He was a very funny man, but very, very smart. And he believed that that the vaccines were causing problems. I got him to watch a film that we did back in, I think, 2016 about mercury in vaccines. And he felt that the mercury had actually injured a member of his family. And he said, I wish I could put this on TV. But he said to me at that time, he said 17 of the 22 advertising slots on my evening news broadcasts are pharma owned. And he said, if a single one of my hosts was to allow you onto their show to talk about this issue, that I would have to fire them. And he said, and if I didn't fire them, I would hear from Rupert, which means Rupert Murdoch, within 10 minutes. Oh, I think, that is from a guy who really believed in it, who really wanted to help and felt like he had it, and who was also a tough guy who was willing to break things, but he was scared of this issue. And I think that's, and so you look at people from other networks who are a lot less willing to go against the orthodoxies, and we don't have a chance there.
Well, this is such a critical point, and I want to get into this further because it is the corrupt relationship between, whether you corrupt, illegal, undisclosed relationship between the FDA, the CDC, and Big Pharma that is really driving this. Tomorrow and Thursday of this week, it's my understanding that the CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices or Policies is set to meet to decide to opine on whether or not to add these COVID vaccines to the childhood vaccination schedule. And for people who are watching, the reason that's critically important is because if those vaccines are added to the childhood immunization program or schedule, they will enjoy blanket immunity. Moderna, Pfizer will have blanket immunity from any liability because of the National Vaccine Injury Protection Program or plan. This is something that you had called out early on, that's their big interest in getting these vaccines into the arms of children so that they can mainstream it and get it on the childhood vaccine schedule. If this happens, and there's been very little talk about it, it's scheduled, my understanding, to happen tomorrow and Thursday. If this happens, Moderna and Pfizer, with the help of the CDC, will receive total liability protection for this vast number of injuries that have happened. And we're only at the tip of the iceberg, if you want my personal opinion. I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet with regard to vaccine injuries. What's your understanding of where that's going? Is there any way to stop it?
Well, you saw President Biden a couple of weeks ago said that the pandemic is over, the emergency is over. And he said that on national television. And then yesterday, the HHS announced that it was extending the emergency for another 3 months. And why are they extending the emergency? Because the emergency allows them to give emergency use authorization to these vaccines and to protect the vaccines under the PrEP Act, to shield them with liability immunity so that no matter how negligent the company is, no matter how reckless, no matter how toxic their products, no matter how ridiculously inept their testing protocols, et cetera, and manufacturing, quality control, and all these other problems they have, you can, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company. So, and that's the only reason that they'll put a vaccine out there. These vaccines are so reactogenic that company would be buried if we were allowed to sue them. All the people out there who've been injured right now and who have died, 30,000 people on VAERS, 1.3 million people injured, dead on VAERS, 1.3 million people injured, 250,000 people seriously, like lifetime injuries. The company would go under. So they will not market a vaccine unless they get full liability protection. Well, the only way legally they can do that when the emergency is over is if they can get it listed as a childhood vaccine, which means it's going to be mandated for many states like California and New York for children. And we know that children get no benefit from this vaccine. Children are harmed by the vaccine. 1 in 2,700 boys will get myocarditis. Probably 1 in 1,100 girls will get a lifetime debilitating neurological injuries from the vaccine. The reactogenicity, this is according to Pfizer's own studies, the data from their studies. I'm not, people, I always say, Kelly, people should not believe what I say, and they should not believe what CDC says. Do your own research. But I'm telling you, and you can go to my website to see Children's Health Defense website. You can see the studies. You can see Pfizer's study there and see what I'm saying to you is true. Oh, they have to get it on that childhood schedule. Now, why, you ask? The people who sit on that panel, which is a panel that's put together by the CDC, it's a panel called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. The people who sit on that panel are not, for the most part, CDC or government employees. And so you think, and Dr. Fauci always describes them as independent doctors and scientists who have made this decision. But if you look at who these people really are, these are people who make their living on grants, developing drugs and vaccines for the pharmaceutical companies. And there is an unwritten rule. They trade places on these committees. They get millions and millions of dollars from pharma. There's a 2008 study showed 97% of them had undisclosed conflicts of interest. And a 2003 investigation by Congress showed that 80% of them were taking payments from the company whose products they were approving. And what happens is you sit on that committee, you work at a university doing clinical trials for pharmaceutical companies. And your phase 2 trial, phase 3 trial is ended, you then take your product back to ACIP and get it approved. So all the people who are on there, many of them in the future will have drugs that need approving. And so they just have this system where they rubber stamp everything for each other. And it says, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. It's a reciprocal altruism deal that they have. There are also studies that show that people, when they leave that panel, are showered with sinecures and with wealth and with grants and with junkets from the pharmaceutical company and from NIH. So they're all given rewards for rubber stamping anything that comes for that panel. So if it goes to that panel is incapable of saying no. It will say yes, no matter, even if they brought something in there and said, this is going to kill all these kids, they would still stamp it, go ahead, because they're all on the take. And, it's many of them are what we call PIs, principal investigators for NIA, for NIAID, for Tony Fauci's. NIH gives away $42 billion a year. And if you add Bill Gates, his foundation, and Wellcome Trust, which is the UK version of the Bill Gates Foundation, they control 63% of the biomedical research funding in the world. So any product that they developed, and they developed the Moderna vaccine, they own half of that vaccine. They will get billions of dollars in royalties. NIH will, and employees in NIH will. So Tony Fauci wants that to go through, and if you disagree with him, he is going to punish you, and he can bankrupt your institution because all these universities rely on NIH funding. All the funding, 63% of the funding in the world for biomedical research, which keeps these medical schools moving, is controlled by that agency and by his, confederates. And so nobody is going to say no to a product that he wants approved, and he wants the Moderna vaccine approved. It's his vaccine. It's his baby. He nurtured it. He created it, and he put it in the first in the pipeline. No animal studies, and he needs it approved. So, and his guys who work for him that he designated are going to make $150,000 a year for life. Between 4 and 6 of his top deputies for life, as long as that thing is approved and it's given liability protection. So this whole thing is just fixed, and they don't, you look at the data and we know this is not going to help children. It is going to harm them grievously.
What I just want to say is that in some laboratories paid by public funds, but of course, when it comes to profit, only the corporations get the profit. It's not distributed amongst us, the people that pay the taxes, whether in the United States, here in Canada, or whatever that is in Europe, especially the United States. We have talked about way before regarding Pfizer and the contracts about Pfizer and their immunity, etc., that you should know. But they have developed, according to Boston laboratories, they have developed using the coronavirus, the COVID-19, they have using gain of function, and using gain of function, which Dr. Fauci have denied forever since the pandemic began. They have created in laboratory a mix of COVID-19 and another virus spike, or a spike of the same virus, which can kill 80% of the experimented mice or people or whatever that is. 80% of the laboratory mice that have been experimented with, 80% died. If we have 1%, as Senator Rand Paul mentioned a few months ago, that was covered in my programs here, you can just watch it, 3 or 4 versions, March or May this year. You can find out the discussions within Congress. You just heard what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said about Congress and the corruption that is going with the lobbies, etc. We already know. And if you don't know, this is not about theories or scandals or stuff. Listen, dude, what is going on with the pandemia is happening with the war, and they're gonna bring the war home. I mentioned that before. The point is, 80% mortality virus created in laboratory, according to the next program that I will deliver for you in the next few minutes. I have to divide this in order not to make it so long. So yeah, 80% mortality. And they're gonna spread it. Oh, I don't know who spread it around the world. No, it's some animal, it's whatever, but it's not us. The government is not the bribery and the corruption. These people are criminal. They deserve to go to jail for life, and their capitals and they're well distributed all around the world. Period. I know you don't like to hear that, not the corporations. That's the way it has to be. And if you think that the next presidential election for the United States, that is if Joe Biden lives enough for the next presidential election, Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know. Are you going to vote for Elon Musk because he's running for president? Make sure that might happen. The other one is, I don't know. The Jewish people have a candidate with this young fellow. I forgot his name. He's, I think, a conservative, a good guy. Yeah, pretty sure. The other one can be Bill Gates. Why don't you run for president, Bill Gates? You will have all the support of the army and the corruption of the Pentagon and weapons industry. Because Canada is doing it right now. All the countries in Europe against Russia. Starving their own people. Look at the inflation here in Canada. Look at the housing pricing here in Canada. Look at the rent going up and up and up and up. Look at the poverty emerging in Canada, something that never happened before. The conservatives and the liberals are but the same. It's like the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States. We are at the brink of extinction, and they want to go to World War III. It's not about the money you have in the bank, idiots. It's about that they don't give a shit. You need to have at least $1 billion in your bank to be considered to go to their bunkers. And the bunkers is not going to be the solution. I'd rather tell you again. These authorities that have been controlling us economically, financially, on healthcare, and now in all decisions, with all this surveillance that has been spread by Julian Assange, release Julian Assange immediately! Is because I can imagine what Julian Assange could have revealed for us, for the country, for the world, regarding this corrupt system that we have. I'm calling my God, whatever you want to live or not, believe on God or not, I'm calling my God. I haven't stopped because these idiots are capable to taking down the world with them as long as the hegemony that they have doesn't go away from their hands. And they have friends with Israel and the United States in the space. Remember, I made a program about that, about the disclosure on UFOs and UAPs, and where an ex-general from Mossad said that they have friends out there, which reminds me, the book of the good book, when it says the struggle is not against flesh and bone, but against principalities in the heavens. So I understand why these people think that the Third World War is to happen, because they already have partners somewhere up there that are going to pick them up and then come back and create another civilization. And you know what is the problem, according to their terms, which is going to end up like this one, or worse. if God exists, is to stop that from happening. For us, for the country, for the world. Hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Way Out Project initiative. Au revoir. Bye bye. Hasta pronto.